We are now going to take a look at terrain zones within procedural terrains and how they can be used and some of the different effects available. So I'm going to create a procedural terrain. Let's go ahead and put a more interesting texture on it. I'll just grab the large scale pale grass, ignore the alpha information. Let's go ahead, we can right click, edit the object. I'm going to turn off the zero edges mode. And now we can see the full terrain a little better. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. I just want to add a little bit of scale. You can open that back up and see that scale change. Now, under the Zone tab, we can see the zone list. Right now, it's just the entire terrain, which is automatically generated based on the initial scale of the terrain. Now, if we take a look at the procedural, with the object parametric, that zone should change its size with scaling outside of the terrain editor. However, when you're using the world mapping mode, there is a possibility that the initial zone that's created will not change scale with the size of the terrain. So that's a possibility. So if we click on View Zones, what we're going to see is the current zone, which is selected, entire terrain, as a red box in the outer bounds of the terrain itself. We also get to see the scene. So now what I can do is add in another zone. Once I click Add, I can draw out a new zone. So let's go ahead and draw this little box over here, which we can see a coordinate for the X and Y for the start and end of the zone. When you're working with zones, and you can switch back and forth between which zones there currently are. Once we define and work with one of the new defined zones, we can see that the Effects tab disappears. And if we go over to the Paint mode, all of the two-dimensional effects are also removed. So we now have the ability to modify only with the 3D brushes. So if we want to sculpt out and modify this, we are restricted to the 3D tools within this zone, at least in the current release I am using. If any future updates open this up a little bit more, then you will see these are no longer grayed out. But at the moment, we are restricted to the 3D tools within these zones. So this allows us to define more specifically if we want to have an area that's going to be using these 3D tools. It'll be a little bit easier to control the polygon range. Now I'm working very closely to the edge of this zone. This is just to demonstrate a point. Typically, you would not want to work so close to the edge of your zone, and we'll see why in just a sec. There are some tools to help in the transition between zones. For now, what I'm going to do is just click OK with this change, and what we're going to see are the two zones kind of intermingling between each other. And we will see a seam because I was working so close to the edge. If I expand the procedural terrain, we're going to see the entire terrain and then the zone. Right now, there is really no ability to go in and select individual zones. It's still all one object. So if we take a look, we can see the modified area, the zone, being blended in with the existing terrain. I'm going to open up the atmosphere editor and just modify sunlight so we can see a little bit better. And just go ahead and do a quick preview render. And this is still rendering out, but we can see that for the most part, actually the zone blend was pretty good. It doesn't really appear to be any tearing around the edges of the zone, which is good. But let's go ahead and make some modifications to kind of force that to happen. Go into the zone, and what I'm going to do is modify the edge. And we're going to be able to see a little bit better. What I'm also going to do is just, for the purpose of previewing, to show you, I'm going to pull up the corners so that we can also see a preview of the zone a little easier within the interface. Not suggested, however, if you're going to actually be working on a project. So this is just to preview it for right now. And that way we can see the corners lifted for the edges of the zone. But if we take a look at the terrain and what's happening, is we have a geometry cutoff where the pixels or the defined polygons for the zone are just basically being cut off and creating a wall. So when you work around the edges, that can happen. Which is why it's a good idea to work away from the edges. And if you're going to define yourself a zone, make sure you give yourself enough room. There are some tools to aid in the blending of this. And I'm just going to let this finish really quick. And the fading option you can see within the zone list is going to help smooth out the transition between these different terrains, because they are essentially separate terrain objects, although they are being blended into one. We can see, because I worked around the edge so closely and raised it up, that there is a crack and a break, separation between the objects, and that's obviously an issue and a problem. So if we go to edit the object and now select this zone, we can choose to turn on fading. When we choose fading, we're given an outline we can see, which is a box, to represent the edge of the terrain. When the size slider is set all the way near the size text, so all the way to the left, it's pretty much opened all the way. And a full size of the terrain, it is difficult to see, and if we go even to the top view, because it is still based on a perspective, it's not actually a flattened top view, we're not going to see it go all the way to the extent, and since the terrain is raised up above the ground because of the fractal, this is not going to completely match up. There's really no way to change that except to lower the terrain below the 0 point within the fractal, which isn't always a good idea. But what we can do is scale or change the size of the zone. The more we increase the slider, the less of the zone is going to be seen. We're sort of defining and cutting out the part of the zone we'd like to use. We can then set a blending between this size that's being pulled out and the entire terrain zone, or the other zones if you have more than one or a couple defined. The type is our fading type. There's a couple of different options, and you're probably going to end up using Gaussian or linear the most. A Gaussian is probably going to be one of the best and produce one of the better blends, as opposed to some of the other ones, which might cause some extra issues, really depending on some of the three-dimensional aspects. So you might need to kind of curve underneath the terrain, and you can use some of those other options for that. But for the most part, except for that corner that I lifted up, this is blending together really well. So this is a great way to not only pull out areas of an infinite terrain, but to say, I'm just going to use these 3D tools in this part of the terrain, draw out the zone, and then not have to worry about those 3D effects on the rest of the object. The only real limitation is that you're restricted to the 3D tools, and you can't use some of the two-dimensional effects directly on the zone. And if I switch over to a wireframe view, in the viewport, we're going to be able to see the blending a little bit better. And depending on how the refresh is of the terrain geometry, you might see an increased or decreased pixel amounts or polygon amounts. And it might be constantly refreshing. But it gives you a good idea of how well the blend is working out, geometry-wise. if you want to take a look at the structure a little bit better. So if we go back and edit the object, we could draw another zone. Now, if I add a zone, a new zone, over the top of where I just modified and created the other zone where I had sculpted out, it is going to overwrite it, and we are going to lose that information. So whenever you have an overlapping zone, the one that is created initially will get replaced by new ones. Unfortunately, there's no option at the moment to sort the zone list. You can set up a fade, which will allow the other one to possibly show through, and it looks like really it is completely overriding it. We're going to go back to that smooth shaded mode, and we don't really see that first zone at all. So what we can also do is select these zones and delete them. So we can grab that new one, delete it. It's going to take us to our view zone list. We can also select clicking on the zone if you want to just highlight that way. The red is going to be the active zone, or at least the one that's closer to red, since if there is another zone behind it, it is going to look a little different with the color change. And I want to make a note that the copy and paste functions are not available or just don't work when you are working with a specific zone. So if I tried to convert this over to standard terrain by copying it, pasting it into a standard terrain, it would not work. It will only use the entire terrain zone and not any specific zones. I also want to note that you can change the name of the zone, and this has to be done within the zone list, since you cannot change the name within the layer, object layer view. So that does need to be done within the terrain editor.
Terrain zones become increasingly helpful when we're using infinite terrains. So let's go ahead and right-click on the procedural terrain icon in order to load in infinite terrain. We're going to use the red rock and sand and discard the ground plane, and we'll go ahead and add the sea level object. And I want to note, if you're having any display problems seeing the terrain underneath the sea, you will need to go up to File and Options, and under the display options there's an option to clip objects under the first horizontal plane. Well, in this case we deleted the ground plane, which would be the first, so the water becomes the new first horizontal plane. So if I turn this option on, what we're going to see is the water clipping out the terrain, and we can't see underneath it. If we hide the object and it's hidden from the scene, and from the viewport, it is still going to show up. So it's important, in order to be able to see the terrain underneath, that you keep that option off if you're not going to have the sea showing up in the render. Even if you are, sometimes it's good to be able to see exactly what's underneath it. So if we select the terrain, edit the object, we can now see the infinite terrain and the entire terrain, and like a zone, it has no effects options or two-dimensional painting options. So if we want to focus on one specific area of the terrain, adding a zone, we can preview the scene and see exactly where our camera is at. Let's say we want to work just around the camera. Go ahead and draw out a new zone. And now we can work in a more defined area, go back and view the zones, and we can see that that zone scale is really quite small. And if you take a look at the coordinate, it's identical, or nearly identical. And
defining a texture, if you wanted to just set a coordinate for a texture on this zone, it would be difficult to set up because the coordinate isn't really long enough to give you a good sense of where it actually is. But let's go ahead and select that zone. We can double click on it to open it up to edit it. And when you're working on a really large terrain like this, you may also notice that the flow of the brush may not be as responsive as it is when viewing the entire terrain. If we turn on the scene preview, we can see the camera, where the sun is at, and now if we want to paint, we have a much easier time of being able to define these areas without having to use intersecting terrains that would cause tearing. When working with an infinite terrain and zones, the same principles still apply, where you do want to fade the edges if you've made any large modifications around them. Either way, even if you stayed far away from the edges, still a good idea to blend that together. With an infinite terrain, really depending on where the sea level is at, and also the 0 point z-axis, the fading box and rectangle will vary in its location. But let's go ahead and set up a filter to paint on this, make it a little more interesting. We're going to go to the last filter, edit it, and we can just customize. And so we can add key points and just kind of randomize this. You can also load in any filter that's available within View from any other part of the program, or also the presets that come with. So you can load any of that in. You'll just need to be careful anytime you're working with these filters around the edges that you're not overextending too much. A few changes have been made to the way filters will clip things out within View 8. So you do have to watch with the curves mode how far you're extending past the total range. So now we have a little more of an interesting filter. And we can see kind of a circular effect. And another thing to keep in mind is the additional differences between the Sculpt and Freeform mode, depending on the type of fall off you have. The initial click is going to be more round as we drag it across. It's going to continue a little bit better than Freeform, where it's constantly changing, which will create more samples, in this case making it a lot rounder. In the inflate mode, you're going to end up with a lot of bulging, as you can see. Almost looks like a couple of toruses, so you may have to smooth out areas like that, but try to refrain from smoothing too much, as it will potentially remove a lot of the procedural that's running over it. And the 3D geometry remains separated from the procedural. So at any time you can modify the procedural and keep your 3D geometry. So that is a really nice option. I'm going to go ahead, set up this fading, and we can take a look at that within the main viewport. So it definitely becomes much easier to work with infinite terrains when you have the zone option. So good idea to take advantage of them if you're working with any sort of infinite terrain or planetary terrain. And I do want to note that the zones will scale with the terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Actually, we'll just go ahead and create a new scene. and I'm going to create procedural terrain with the world mapping mode. Just make the scale a little larger, turn off zero edges. So if we take a look, edit the object, we're going to go into the zones, view them, we're going to go ahead and add one in. Click OK, and now we can scale the terrain. Go back to edit the object, and when we view the zones, we're going to see where that original one was drawn. So you don't have to worry about scaling world coordinate terrains and losing any zones or 3D information connected to them. I also want to note that if you convert your procedural terrain with zones over to a standard terrain, it will delete all of your zones. The only zone that will be kept is the entire terrain zone. So they're fairly straightforward, easy to use. Hopefully we can see some further development in the future with them in order to be able to control and connect other objects to them in order to really gain a huge benefit from them. At the moment, I would highly suggest always saving your scene frequently, and before really doing any major zone work, that's going to be important that you have a different version of the scene saved out before changes are made in order to prevent any problems from happening and not being able to go back to the terrain you previously had.